Elvis Presley's granddaughter Riley Keough is opening up about her plans for Graceland and a promise to her mother.
Memphis, Tennessee, a quiet stretch of Highway 51, late one evening in 1957. A 22-year-old singer pulls up to a colonial-style farmhouse surrounded by oak trees and pastureland, far from the crowds that have started following him everywhere he goes. He isn't buying a mansion. He's buying silence. That house would become Graceland, and nearly 70 years later, the silence he was chasing still lives on its second floor, a level of the home that has remained locked, protected, and untouched by the public since the day he died. Now, for the first time in decades, the woman who owns that house and that silence is choosing to speak about it carefully and on her own terms. To understand why the upstairs of Graceland carries so much weight, you have to go back before Elvis Presley ever set foot inside it. The land the house sits on was originally part of a 500-acre farm belonging to Stephen C. Tough, a Memphis businessman, in the 19th century. It was his granddaughter, Ruth Moore, and her husband, Dr. Thomas Moore, who built the house itself in 1939, naming it Graceland after Ruth's aunt, Grace Tough. It was a dignified but modest structure for its time, built in the colonial revival style with white columns and a wide front porch, a home meant for a respected Memphis family, not yet the cultural landmark it would become. For nearly 2 decades, it sat quietly on the edge of the city, known to almost no one outside Memphis society. In 1957, at the height of his early stardom, Elvis Presley purchased the property from the Moore family for a reported $102,500, a considerable sum at the time, reflecting not just the size of the estate but its privacy. Elvis was 22 years old, freshly wealthy, and already suffocating under the kind of fame no young performer before him had ever experienced. Fans camped outside his family's previous home on Audubon Drive, forcing him to search for something further removed from the city center, something with land, distance, and gates. Biographer Peter Guralnick, whose 2-volume work on Presley's life remains one of the most respected accounts of the singer's story, has written extensively about how desperately Elvis wanted a retreat, a fixed point away from the chaos that had swallowed his daily life. Graceland became that retreat, and over the next 2 decades, he transformed it into something the Moore family would barely recognize. The house grew louder, stranger, and more personal with each passing year. Elvis added a racquetball court, a swimming pool, and a wall of records and gold discs that would eventually become one of the most photographed rooms in American pop culture. The Jungle Room, added in the late 1960s, became one of the most talked about spaces in the house, with its green shag carpeting stretching even across the ceiling, its carved wooden furniture, and its unmistakable air of theatrical escape. It doubled as a working studio in his final years, the site of some of his last recording sessions in February and October of 1976, producing tracks that would appear on the albums from Elvis Presley Boulevard, Memphis, Tennessee, and Moody Blue. Musicians who worked those sessions later described an atmosphere that was informal, almost domestic, microphones set up among the furniture rather than in a traditional studio booth. Behind the house, the Meditation Garden, designed in 1964, became a place of quiet reflection during his lifetime and, tragically, his final resting place after his death in August of 1977, alongside his parents, his grandmother, and later his daughter, Lisa Marie Presley. It remains one of the few places on the proper where the noise of Graceland's fame quiets down, where visitors often stand in silence rather than take photographs, a stark contrast to the energy of the tour that leads them there. Since opening to the public in 1982, Graceland has welcomed more than 20 million visitors, making it the second most visited private home in America, trailing only the White House. Tourists move slowly through the living room, the dining room, the jungle room, past the trophy building filled with gold records and stage costumes, past the racquetball court where Elvis played hours before his death. Every tour follows the same path, guided by audio narration that has been updated and re-recorded multiple times over the decades, most notably with a version narrated by John Stamos. But every tour, no matter the year, stops at the same staircase. The second floor of Graceland, where Elvis lived out his final years and where he ultimately died, has never been part of the public tour. Not once, in over 40 years. That decision wasn't made by a marketing team or a museum board. It was made by Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, in the immediate aftermath of his son's death. According to accounts from Graceland's own archivists and confirmed in multiple authorized histories of the estate, Vernon insisted the upstairs remain closed, not open for tours, not restaged for cameras, left largely as it was. It wasn't framed as a business decision. It was framed as an act of grief, and it has held for nearly half a century, through changes in ownership, changes in management, an enormous public curiosity that has only grown with time rather than faded. Ownership of Graceland has passed through only a handful of hands since 1977. Vernon Presley managed the estate until his own death in 1979. Priscilla Presley, acting as trustee on behalf of a young Lisa Marie, was the one who made the pivotal decision in the early 1980s to open the ground floor to the public, a move that transformed Graceland from a private family home into a self-sustaining historic site and saved it from the kind of financial collapse that swallowed other celebrity estates in the years after their owners' deaths. It was, by most accounts, a shrewd and difficult decision, one that turned grief into stewardship and kept the house in the family rather than seeing it sold off piece by piece. Lisa Marie inherited full ownership when she turned 25 in 1993, and she remained the primary owner until her death in January of 2023. Those who knew her, including longtime friends and Graceland staff quoted in outlets like People magazine over the years, have described her relationship with the house as complicated, a place of both comfort and heavy memory, somewhere she returned to often but also a site inseparable from the loss of her father. Ownership then passed to her 3 surviving children, with her eldest daughter, Riley Keough, becoming the sole trustee and public face of the estate. That transition was not without conflict. In the months following Lisa Marie's death, Priscilla Presley publicly challenged the validity of a 2016 amendment to her daughter's trust, an amendment that had removed Priscilla as co-trustee in favor of Riley Keough and her siblings. The dispute drew significant media coverage, was reported extensively by outlets including Variety, The Hollywood Reporter, and the Associated Press, and raised uncomfortable questions about the authenticity of the document itself. It was ultimately settled privately in May of 2023, with Riley Keough confirmed as sole trustee of the estate. It was a reminder that behind the mythology of Graceland sits a very real, very valuable legal structure, one worth an estimated hundreds of millions of dollars in property, licensing rights, and intellectual property tied to Elvis Presley's name and image. Since taking on that role, Riley Keough has spoken publicly, in interviews with outlets such as Vanity Fair and People, about her personal history with the house, describing childhood visits to Graceland and her close relationship with her mother, who remained deeply protective of the property throughout her life. Keough has described Graceland less as a museum to be curated and more as a home that continues to hold emotional weight for her family, a place tied to memory rather than spectacle. She has been notably private about the specifics of the second floor itself, declining to give detailed tours of the space or allow cameras inside, a position consistent with the family's approach since 1977, and one she has continued rather than reversed since assuming control. That silence has never stopped speculation from filling the gap. For decades, the sealed upstairs has fueled some of the most persistent conspiracy theories in American pop culture, chief among them the enduring belief that Elvis faked his own death. Believers point to his growing reclusiveness in his final years, his declining health, and unverified sightings that followed his death, including a widely circulated but never substantiated claim involving the alias John Burroughs, a name Elvis was known to use when checking into hotels while touring. Some point to a spelling discrepancy on his gravestone, where his middle name appears as Aaron, rather than his birth certificate spelling of Aaron, a detail conspiracy theorists have treated as significant despite genealogists and Graceland historians confirming it was simply a correction to match his twin brother's spelling, made at the family's request. None of these claims have ever been substantiated by forensic, medical, or legal evidence, and Elvis's death was confirmed by autopsy, witnessed by his family, and followed by a public funeral attended by thousands of mourners who lined the streets of Memphis. A second, quieter mystery involves the music itself. Elvis's former producer, Felton Jarvis, spoke on multiple occasions before his own death in 1981 about recordings Elvis made privately that were never intended for commercial release, informal sessions at home, rough vocal takes, material RCA never processed for the label. Music historians, including Ernst Jorgensen, whose book Elvis Presley, A Life in Music, remains the definitive chronicle of his recording career, have confirmed that not everything Elvis recorded in his final years made it to vinyl. Whether any of that material still exists somewhere inside Graceland, uncatalogued and unheard, remains genuinely unknown, and Graceland's archival team has never confirmed nor denied it, a silence that only deepens the fascination. What is confirmed is the scale of preservation work now underway. Riley Keough has spoken about supporting expanded archival and educational initiatives tied to Graceland, moving beyond tourism toward scholarship, partnering with institutions to study Elvis's cultural impact more seriously, examining his influence on music, race, and American identity in ways that go deeper than the standard gift shop narrative. Digitization efforts are ongoing for handwritten materials, photographs, and documents tied to his life, a slow, careful process meant to preserve fragile originals for future generations rather than rush them into public display for short-term attention. In the end, the upstairs of Graceland may never be opened, and that appears to be exactly the point. For a man who spent his adult life almost entirely in public view, watched, photographed, and consumed by an audience that never fully let him rest, one floor of one house remaining private feels less like a secret and more like a boundary, quietly honored by the people who loved him most. Riley Keough now holds the responsibility of maintaining that boundary, not to conceal anything scandalous, but to protect what her family has always insisted was simply personal. Whatever remains behind that locked staircase, a father's grief, a daughter's memory, or nothing more than an untouched room frozen at 1977, it continues to remind the world that even the most famous man in America was, in the end, still someone's son, still someone's father, and still upstairs,